I first met Marcus over 10 years ago at a recording studio that he was running in Sydney, Australia. Since then, his career has exploded. He's worked with artists like Childish Gambino, Fleetwood Mac, Neil Finn and Crowded House, Camila Cabello, and so many more. He has a wide range of experience, and today we are going to talk to him about building the rigs for Fleetwood Mac and Neil Finn, and his experience teching on tour with these guys for the last couple of years. Sit back, enjoy. We'll also put more links about Marcus and what he's been up to below. Check it out, enjoy. So we're here with Marcus, and Marcus, we met originally in Sydney, Australia through a mutual friend. You were running a studio in Sydney, and at that point, I don't know how much of this resume that I'm about to spit out you had come to realize, but this is probably, would it have been, was Echo Creative like what, 11 years ago, 12 years ago?
I think it was 10 years ago when we built it.
Which is an awesome studio, like from a converted kind of warehouse kind of vibe, and you turned it into a studio in Sydney. And since then, and at that point, you have worked, I have my list here so I don't miss anyone, but the list is impressive. Fleetwood Mac, Neil Finn and Crowded House, Childish Gambino, the X Factor, which is an Australian version of a singing competition, talent competition in Australia, right? Neo, Chris Isaac, Rita Ora, Fifth Harmony, Camila Cabello, Hilary Duff, Rob Thomas, and the list kind of goes on. You've worked with everyone.
Yeah, yeah, not everyone, but yeah, I've had a pretty good run from a boy from Western Sydney, I guess.
That's awesome, man. And so you obviously play guitar. You're comfortable in a studio because you built and ran one, and you also tour manage and direct. You've got a whole bunch of skills up your sleeve when it comes to the music industry. What is the most recent gig that you are currently working on? Your jacket doesn't give it away at all. What are you currently doing?
Yeah, so I just finished the Fleetwood Mac World Tour right before COVID came along and ruined everything for everybody.
Yeah.
So we're all very thankful that we kind of got 2 years in. So we just finished that, and now we actually rolled, literally no days off, rolled straight in classic Neil Finn fashion. We rolled straight into a Crowded House record here in LA. So I drove from the very last show in San Fran. I drove a truck full of Neil's gear all the way down to the recording studio in Hollywood and loaded straight in and started at United. So we were there when COVID struck, and we went onto lockdown. And I mean, you know, I would have been, what is it now? It's November. So we would have already finished one Australian tour, a European tour, the first leg of the US tour, and we would have just been about to go to Australia again and New Zealand for the second leg. And we've done none of it, which is insane. So yeah, technically, last thing I did was crazy, even though it's the next thing that's coming as well.
Yeah. Oh man. So whose gear are we looking at right now behind you?
Mainly Neil's. I'm coming to you from a Fleetwood Mac Neil Finn locker here in Los Angeles. There's predominantly Neil's stuff, and now that we are kind of rolling into hopefully Crowded House dates, they've just announced New Zealand for March 2021 for all you Kiwis out there, your wife included.
Yep.
I've kind of like made this a workshop at the moment where we're building the rigs. The Crowded House lineup is a brand new lineup. It's got Liam, Neil's son, Elroy, his other son plays drums, Nick, the original bass player, and then Mitchell Froome, who is the original producer from, I think, the first 3 Crowded House records.
Okay.
And they do all the big songs. So he's on keys, which is real cool. And so what that means is like coming in and modernizing and rebuilding, you know, everything, especially coming off the back of Fleetwood Mac, which, you know, is as far as luxuries of being an artist, it's pretty up there. Like you get everything you need and nothing tends to break. We have spares of everything and stuff. So coming into a house now, So yeah, I'm in this lockup and there's gear everywhere. This is the clean corner of the lockup.
Yeah.
I've pushed everything up there.
Yeah, we won't talk about what's behind the camera, but that's awesome, man. So you're coming off the back of Fleetwood Mac, which was you were teching mainly for Neil. As a tech, I have a few questions I wanted to ask you from your teching point of view. When you are about to head out on tour, what about their pedal board, amps, guitars, anything in the rig itself inspires confidence, as in this is a solid rock, like a rock solid rig, and it's going to last the tour? Is there anything that you see that really fills you with confidence in that area of the gig?
Patch cables that are brand new and specifically made by a tech called Audio. I like, Steve McDonald, one of the techs on Fleetwood Mac, when I came into it, it was a huge learning curve to be kind of very luckily thrusted to a higher level than I was at previously, teching wise. And so I had all these kind of older techs around me who, we're talking like resumes of like the Beach Boys and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, the Eagles, Eric Clapton, these kind of guys who have been touring since, the late 60s, early 70s, and like watching over all my work. And Steve McDonald, probably one of my bigger mentors, was like, your entire rig is only as good as the weakest part of it, the weakest component. And is that a patch cable? Like, are you legitimately going to put your entire show and the success of your headline set at Splendor or Glastonbury or whatever it is on a patch cable, And it's so dumb, and I know you're laughing because you basically started a company because of this.
Yep.
But it's true, man. It blows my mind the amount of times I'm called in to work like a one-off or whatever for a gig, and they've spent so much money on MIDI switching solutions, and Ableton is switching patches and all this stuff, and there's like a $6 patch cable on the board, and you're like, are you serious? How did this happen? Who signed off on this?
Yep.
So the flip side of that is the confidence is when you see a well-made pedal board or a loom or just seeing that someone has put the thought into not what looks pretty, but what's going to go wrong. You can tell when someone's had that frame of mind as opposed to this looks rad. I've ran the cables neat, So that's what instills my confidence walking into the gig.
Is there anything outside of patch cables that you've seen over the years of teching, playing guitar, that you look at a pedal board and you're like, this is not gonna last a tour? And it might just be patch cables. That might be the main thing. But is there anything outside of that you get quite nervous seeing on a touring board?
Yeah, I think power supplies is a big one that I've learned. There are so many, options out there to buy from something that's really cheap to something that's really expensive. And not everybody, myself included when I was younger, not everybody realizes that everything just needs to have a cable plugged in from a power supply, and that's it. That we would start talking about milliamps and the draw and what's on at the same time, and is it better on a battery, and all these different power elements. And it's really quite intense. Like I've played guitar since I was 12 years old in touring bands pretty much, and I didn't realize the extent of things like power and how much that does affect your tone and the strength of your actual pedal board build, especially when you start talking internationally, when we're getting different power, amperage and circuits and stuff like that. It's a big deal.
Yeah. This was actually a question I was going to save for later, but it feels like a great time to ask it. Both as a tech and as a guitar player, is there one thing or two things that you always have to have a redundancy for? You have to have a backup of this item, or you have to be ready just in case this thing goes down, you've got your backup. Is there anything that you won't leave home without?
Always a tuner. Generally, although it's not at all the tuner I would like to use, it's a Boss tuner, like a 2-3 is by far still the most generic on-a-board tuner. Does everything you want it to do, takes simple power, in daisy chain the power off it, that kind of stuff. Daisy chain, like a well-built daisy chain is always useful. And a barrel connector is probably one of the biggest things that I actually, strangely and probably quite stupidly, never used to carry for a long time until I got onto Fleetwood Mac and again, Steve McDonald, that tech, was like, why do you not have like, he basically had like a belt, you know, with like little pouches in it with barrel connectors. And he's like, during the show, like anything could go down, anything can happen. You're going to need like one of your barrels to just get past it, like just get straight through it, you know?
Yeah.
And I've used it 100 times since then. I don't know why I never thought to just always have a barrel connector in my pocket, whether that be like, you know, quarter inch or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So you got yeah, it sounds like you got a couple tricks and tips up your sleeve that you've learned over the years. And I mean, I guess, I don't know if you'd agree with this saying, but no matter how much you prepare, something still might go wrong and you need to be ready for it. Hey.
Always. I mean, you know, we talk about Fleetwood Mac, like walking into that, it's one of the biggest budgets and I guess allowances of shopping lists, you know, as far as gear goes that you could possibly have, and things still broke. You know, I've come from touring, especially as an Australian, touring the world. We fly everywhere. They're, you know, that's cool. You get to go to Europe and you load a truck on day one in London or wherever you are, but you're still flying the bulk of the gear to get there. So the parameters of like everything has to be 32 kilos and under, within a certain, you know, dimension, fits inside a Pelican case. And then the cost, you know, alone, Australian bands don't have the budgets because of flights and things like that. So I came from this world where like, it's like, get everything they want into this small box. And then I walked into Fleetwood and they're like, oh, that's cool. Anything you want or you need, I don't want to have a problem during the show. It's basically the gist of that, you know?
Yeah.
So again, like those techs, these mentors of mine were like, you know, hey, what's that guitar? And I'd be like, oh, well, this is this 12 string. He uses it for, you know, 1 minute and 25 seconds of one song in this 2-hour set. And they're like, cool, there needs to be 3 of them. And I was like, he doesn't need 3 of them, you know, like if it goes down, he'll play a cardboard box, you know, and make it work somehow. They're like, it doesn't matter, it needs to be 3. That's why, like behind me, you know, there's 9 or 10, you know, Gretsch Duo Jets, and there's 3 or 4 Les Pauls, and there is like quite literally doubles and triples of everything, because things break, man. You can spend all the money in the world, and like if you're setting up and pulling down every day, something's gonna break, and they do.
So for the guitar player that doesn't have the budget, like realistically, 99.9% of guitars can't buy 3 of their main, 2 of their backup. Like, so what would you say, like top 3 most important things you need to consider when preparing for a bigger gig as a guitar player with a lower budget? What would you say is, you know, top of the checklist? Have a tuner, you've already said. What else would you say?
Well, I think that no matter the scale or the level you're at as a guitar player, the same things tend to break. Cables, you know, a cable shorting out, making that horrific grounding sound, that's pretty common. So I would always have a spare cable sitting next to my pedal board, or some kind of, like, you guys have a great system, you know, where you can have 2 cables, or a Leela switcher or anything like that, where you can have it grab, plug in, new cables on. I would always have a second guitar of some kind. Obviously, at this level, it could be an identical guitar, but you know, previously it's just a guitar to grab while you tech 3 strings, or you maybe don't have a tech you need to continue on. Just kind of sitting down and thinking about, like, what are the things that commonly break? It doesn't change from gig to gig, really. And like at the end of the day, your amp goes down, like your amp goes down. It doesn't matter whether you have me, you know, on the side of the stage watching it. It takes me the same amount of time to go up there awkwardly during a show and pull out an amp and flip it around, you know.
Yeah.
So those kind of things are outside of your control, and you know, you learn to deal with that being a performer, I guess. But those little things like cables and maybe a power supply, you've got one in your, you know, in your Pele case on the side of the stage or something. Just those little things that always tend to break. Yeah,
nice. You have your Crowded House gig, the tour coming up, COVID permitting. It will happen. How do you actually prep? So let's say yesterday the tour was announced and you are leaving in 3 months. What fills that 3 months worth of time getting ready for a tour as a guitar tech?
It depends. If it's a band that's been on rotation touring wise somewhat recently, the preparation is more just like basic things, like, you know, you can go through every single guitar, every single amp, every single cable, and you're putting the rigs together, you're playing, all that type of stuff. And, I guess that falls under more like the maintenance kind of category of things. But then for a band like Crowded House, who haven't been out in, I think the last show was 8, 9, 10 years ago, something like that. And it's a whole new line. We're designing now. So we're back to sitting in a room, listening to a record, having conversations with Neil and Liam and Nick, and how they want to represent the tones that they played on the record, where they obviously could sit down and play this guitar through that amp and, stuff like that. So this time for us, since I guess the beginning of lockdown pretty much, has been spent going back through the record and building these rigs, like the one behind me that is Neil's, and working out how we're going to go through that. And that was a huge thing, like going into Fleetwood Mac for us. Neil himself, Neil was very huge artist. He's very like punk, grassroots, DIY, like a simple amp, like a simple guitar. Doesn't ever ask for, the masses of gear, which is so cool. Like it's unheard of, basically.
Yep.
And it's awesome as a tech. Doesn't mean that we don't need that stuff, but he doesn't request it, or, he's not picky about that kind of thing. So going to Fleetwood was really tough. Like, not only are you designing a show that has never been played before, but we're trying to make Neil Finn somewhat fit within the mold of Lindsey Buckingham, who he was replacing, which is, Neil said himself, like he can't be Lindsey Buckingham. He has to be Neil Finn within Fleetwood Mac, which is such a mammoth task. And it took us months and months of rehearsals and like configurations of, these two amps we did. Wet, dry, wet, one of your favorite topics, in stereo, and 2, dual mono. And we did this amp and that amp. There's a guy here in Hollywood called Brett Allen, who's actually quite randomly Australian. And the day I got to LA to start Fleetwood, someone gave me a contact for him and said, call this guy. He's got a huge vintage amp collection. He randomly is from Adelaide, Australia. He's been here for 40 years, I think. Crazy. He has the biggest collection of amps in Los Angeles. And worked for Split Ends, Neil's old band, when he was like 16. Just so
crazy.
Anyway, so we called him, and he was great. He was like, "I'm going to ship you 50 of like basically the bee's knees of guitar amps in history." And he just trucked them over to us, and we sat down and we went like, one of them was this one behind me, Gibson GA50. And we went like that in a box, and then we went like a Fender Bassman, 59 Bassman, and whatever. Like we went through all these combinations and sculpted tones. So it's crazy. So like the 3 months you're talking about can be anything from restringing guitars to like completely designing the tone of a show.
It sounds like, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes of having to listen to all these different amp combinations, rig configurations, and I'm getting like audio listening fatigue just hearing you talk about it. I think about sitting in front of a concert level amp for an hour, just an hour, and I'm starting to, it might just be because I'm getting older, but how do you keep a fresh perspective, good opinions and insight for Neil while you guys are working together through this mammoth task of coming up with his touring rig?
I try to not let Neil be there for most of it. It's so like you basically nailed it. It's so fatiguing, and Neil doesn't want to stand in front of like I said, he's like a punk grassroots dude. Like quite literally, his favorite amp is like a small Fender Princeton, and he would play just that amp and his Gretsch 59 Firebird every day of the week. He, that's what he wants. So coming into like sculpting tone and stuff, it's not really his jam. So I spent a lot of time there with my colleagues, like my other techs on Fleetwood Mac, and I would sit and play the tech recordings and try to just break it up into small increments and use like amps that I know are classic tones, that still represent what Neil Finn's tone is, which is a pretty transparent, pretty simple overdrive that you would get from a Fender or a Box AC30 or whatever, and work out the combinations. Like for example, the wet, dry, wet thing we tried just didn't work, and it was unnecessary. I think there's 3 guitar players in Fleetwood Mac, including Mike Campbell from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, who has 6 amps on stage. Just the most and you know, that poses a whole nother thing of like, how do you fit within this? You know, Neil Haywood is a session guitar player who has a very classic kind of like Roland synthy. You know, he does a lot of those kind of Lindsey Buckingham synth sounds, and he does all this amazing complementary stuff. And there's this Mike Campbell, Tom Petty and Heartbreakers tone, which is just so intense and loud. And, you know, somehow you search for the gap. Like, what is the gap? And I guess conveniently for us, the gap was that transparent kind of overdrive tone, the bedrock or the fundamental tone that needs to be there for a front of house guy to mix a nice show is Neil's tone. So it worked out quite well for us. Just took a while to get there.
So did you guys end up, you said you tried all these different configurations, wet, dry, wet, stereo, dual mono. Did you end up with a dual mono Fender based sound? Like, what was the final result?
Yeah, so it ended up in a weird, I call it like the most intense simple rig in the world. Because, again, coming back to what Neil likes is simplicity. So we were right next to Stevie Nicks on stage. It's a giant stage, but Stevie and Neil, or the aesthetic of the show, right next to that. So originally, I found that the perfect combination was a vintage Vox AC30 and 59 bass. Like,
awesome.
You know, like, how could you go wrong? It's like a Tom Petty tone or whatever. It's like the two of the best. We ran dual mono because I said like wet, dry, wet and stuff like that. Even stereo wasn't necessarily necessary. And with Neil moving around the amount he was, dual mono was the best way to kind of just encompass his little position on the stage without too much, you know, too much flailing around. But then being next to Stevie, it was so loud, even with it ears in, you know, to get a 59 bassman to sound, you know, that little bit of overdrive, we're talking like, you know, insane volumes. So then it came up with the issue that I had to take them off stage into what's next to me on the left here are these big isolation cabs that I designed, which was cool. But then Neil really felt like he's missing that DIY punk, you know, crowded house split ends thing where there's an amp behind him. He goes up and he uses it for feedback and vibe, and he really honestly didn't like it. He didn't like having in-ears and that type of thing. So then we built this rack, not dissimilar actually to the one behind me, using the Radial JX gear, where I basically split it so that the input from Neil's guitar comes into the rack, pretty simple, via a wireless or a cable. We use both. That split off into lots of different directions. So in one isolation cab off stage, there's two Vox AC30s, a main and a redundant. And I designed it so there's a flippable baffle. So coming back to what you were talking about before with like redundancy and things like that, both amps were on always and split at the front of the isolation cab so that the baffle can just flip around. So if something went down, I opened it up, flipped it, or both always mic'd, and it was as simple as hitting a switch. Then the other isolation case had two Fender bassmans. We actually ended up using reissues, not 59s, and they were really good. Then the rack also sent a different line back to stage, which had the Gibson GA50 and a Fender Princeton, one of Mike Campbell's original Tom Petty Fender Princetons, behind Neil. So they were both kind of low volume, but representing the same as what a bassman and AC30 did. You know, the Gibson trying to give it that grunt, and then the Fender's that kind of pristine tone that he loves. So in the end, this simple rig ended up with 6 amps in it, all coming from the rack. But for Neil, yeah, I know it was intense to get to that point. But for Neil, it felt like he just had a pedal board and an amp, right? Even though, you know, the radial stuff, like the pedal board goes out in a different loop. Neil being on a wireless sometimes and a cable sometimes posed an issue. So there was a splitter box behind his amps that I controlled, which also goes back to the rack. So like we're talking 4 looms, like going 4 different directions on stage. Like it ended up being quite the rig. And this crowded house rig's not dissimilar. The only thing we don't have is wireless anymore.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, the amps that were on stage were not mic'd up.
They were in the end. Initially, they were like a vibe thing for him.
Yep.
And Dave Morgan, the front of house guy, is very, very famous front of house guy, was like, it's something about like, you know, the Fender, the Princeton and the J50 combination. He's like, it would be such a shame not to have that. He already had 390,000 lines of audio coming to the front of house desk. So what's two more, right? Like there were flavors, you know, like I said, the Mike Campbell thing is a big wall of sound, and Campbell's tone is Campbell's tone. It can't be mistaken, and you can pan it and push it up in solos and stuff. But like I said, the bedrock of the tone ended up being Neil's stuff. So I think he enjoyed having like the combinations. So, you know, jumping them onto one channel and being able to push up a Fender Vox or a Fender Gibson.
It sounds like just an unbelievable rig. I love the combination. I'm a huge Vox guy. I love Voxes. But the combination of an AC30 and a Bassman together, and just the frequencies that are covered. Oh man, brilliant.
Yeah. I don't think I realized that it's, you know, a Fender Bassman, I 100% ever since working with them is my favorite amp in the world. Like, it is just the tone, the transparency from it. You know, Voxes, you get a good Vox and you melt, right?
Yep.
It is the greatest in the world. But there are a lot of Voxes that aren't that. Bassmans, like the one that's next to me in the lockup here is like a brand new Bassman that we took on tour. It's off the factory shelf, and 9 times out of 10, I would never do that. And most of those amps aren't going to sound great. They sound awesome, man. And they never break, ever.
Yep.
So, and the Bassmans, add
There
one to
you
your
go.
block.
Yeah, there you go. I think I might have to. I might have to build my own dual mono rig over here. That's brilliant, man. So moving on to the tour that's coming up with Crowded House, you are building the rigs for Neil, Liam, and Nick getting ready for this next tour. Can you talk us through, let's say you have a blank slate. So I know this is not quite the case with these guys, but you have a blank pedal board, you know roughly what the artist wants in terms of pedals. How do you start approaching things like layout, signal chain, and then onto the builds? Are you working extremely closely with the artists, or do you basically say, this is what makes the most sense for tour? I'm going to be the one really using it a lot of the time as the tech. Like, how do you approach that and find the balance between artist and your opinions and all that?
No, it's always what the artist wants. I mean, I think that you can have a very hands-on artist who knows what they want, and you can have an artist who's at a point in their career where they just want to walk on stage and have a really well-built system, but it's still what they want. And no one is going to go on stage and feel uncomfortable, right? In the case of Crowded House, like Liam Finn has such an impeccable knowledge of tone, like arguably more than anyone I've ever met in my life. He knows how to, you know, like you get Chase Bliss pedals. You know, we're huge fans of Earthquaker devices for Liam, because Liam does a lot of obscure, and you can go back and listen to Liam Finn records, and there are some strange tones on there from strange instruments and strange pedals. No one knows how to control those things, most people. Liam Finn has this innate ability to be able to control them all instantly. He pulls it out of the box and he knows what he wants. So the board behind me, which I'll send you a photo of, Liam's one, has a few of those type of Earthquaker devices pedals on them. Some classic things like a Memory Man and stuff, and all of that is his design. It's everything that he knows he wants. And right now there are sections that aren't glued down because he's still changing his mind and working on them. So we're still kind of, you know, moving things around. We've just added a Mel 9 pedal to cover some of those more like synthy type things. So yeah, very much the artist's design. It's my job always, and any techs watching, there seems to be some techs in the world, and I had them as a guitar player, who feel like a tech knows better than the artist. Even if the tech has a world of knowledge more than the artist, we never know more than the artist. That's why we're not the artist, you know?
Yep.
It's a massive like learning curve for a lot of techs, that it doesn't matter if you're working for like a 15-year-old kid who's the next Kurt Cobain, who had, you know, a shitty Fender Strat and a Fender Princeton. Whatever tone he has at the point that he blows up big enough to have a tech, like somehow he stumbled on that and he found that, and that's his tone, and you don't know it, he knows it, you know? And that's like a hard thing to kind of stomach sometimes. You're like, well, this can't work, and you know, these don't go together, but actually they do. And like our job as techs is to kind of morph and mold to support whatever it is that's presented to us.
I love that perspective, man. I think that's spot on. And even with rig builds, I'll be on the phone with customers and asking them questions. They're telling me about their signal chain. Like, that's interesting. I would not do that on my personal board. And instead of saying, that's wrong, you need to put your volume pedal here, or that's wrong, you need to run it this way, I'll just ask questions. And it's like, oh, so normally this is what a lot of people would do. And what's your thought? And if you're open to it, you can learn like, oh, it creates this weird tone that's the only way they could have found it, and they stumbled upon it. And yeah.
That's find new things, right? It's like the old like out of phase pickup thing, like it was Jimmy Page or Lindsey Buckingham or someone had out of phase pickups and it created this tone, and now people do that specifically. Or having different capacity pots. You know, you buy a shitty pawn shop guitar and it's got the wrong volume pot in it, and it opens up the treble, and all of a sudden you have a different guitar. Whatever it is, it's like you can know everything in the world, and that's what's awesome about what we do, is that there is no right answer. And there's definitely times where you sit down with an artist, especially working at, you know, the more beginnings of their career, and I talk to them about, well, I've encountered that when I've done it this way, I've had success, or the tone is a little bit better, or this pedal actually does sound really great, you should try it. But that's like, there are techs out there who would flip it, you know, on the board, and that's not cool. I'm not cool with that. It pisses me off.
Awesome. That's good to know. I'm glad that actually came up. That's really cool. Because I think it encourages people to break the rules, even though there really aren't any. Like, try some new things, get out of the normal signal chain. And yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. So we talked a little bit about Neil's rig, which is behind you. Can you walk us through the signal chain, starting with let's just talk about his main guitar and then going into his pedal board. Where does it all begin? What guitar does he prefer?
It almost always begins with his red Gretsch Duojet, the 1959 Duojet that I think he's had for about 12, 13 years. So it's kind of appeared through a lot of the Graded House kind of stuff. It's always his go-to. I think it's both a comfort thing as well as a tone thing. I took it to Gretsch here in Los Angeles, California, and I was like, I need another one of these. Like we work really closely with Gretsch, especially on Fleetwood Mac, and there are so many Duojets in this rack and more up here. And they're all amazing. Like, they all are great, but none of them at all felt like this one we have, this 59. And I just always, heard Steve McDonald, the other tech's voice in my head about, being as strong as your weakest link. And it's like, if this guitar goes missing, if it breaks, if it's down, I know that Neil's going to feel it, So I took it into Gretsch, and we went to the custom shop, and Stephen Stern, who's a master builder there, sat down with it. And he said during this era of Gretsch, like, every single Gretsch was different for no reason. Like, they basically must have went, well, we've got this left over, let's make this a guitar neck, So like Neil's, for example, like the headstock is so much thicker than any other Gretsch headstock, and nobody knows why. Like, same thing, like Mike Campbell has a White Falcon from roughly that era, and Gretsch took it and X-rated it because they were like, why is this so different to all the other White Falcons? Nobody has the answer. So we took it, we X-rated it, we measured every way. Stephen Stern measured everything to do with it. Yeah. So we're just picking shit up. Put that down. So he measured everything and actually built a custom shop replica, hand built everything to do with it. It took a long time, and it's really damn close. We tried TV Jones stock pickups, which are amazing, and they're in all the Gretches, and they weren't quite right. So I sent our pickups to TV Jones, to Tom. I think he's in Washington, and he tried to match them with some custom shop ones. So we ended up with a pretty identical version of Neil's guitar, which is cool. So I don't know why that's his number one per se, but there's something about it. And I hope one day we're in the same place and I can show you, like, the second you pick it up, it's like, it's just a singer-songwriter's guitar. It just feels like home. And I know that sounds dumb, but I hope guitar players out there get what I mean by that. You feel like you want to sit down and play a G to a D. Like same two chords over and over, and they sound amazing, resonant, beautiful.
Yep.
So that's the main guitar.
Mm-hmm.
As far as signal chain, I touched on it before because of the radial switching device that we have behind me here. There's two of them in this rack. That's basically, if you think of it as the brains of everything. So if we were flying everywhere and maybe more in like a slightly smaller position touring-wise, the possibility of flying a rack is obviously kind of diminished. So I guess I could build it into a fly rack, you know, a more lightweight kind of robust thing, or you go to switches, you know, on pedal boards and stuff, which I've done in the past with you guys, with bands like DMAs and Gang of Youths and Chet Faker, even bands where we are flying all the time, but we're using multiple devices, amps, whatever, campers. So in our case, we luckily freight a lot of our gear, so I can build a rack like this. This is a 14 RU rack. So the radials here are basically the brains. They do everything. Radial have a bunch of really great switches, but this one specifically is more when you have more inputs and less outputs. And the yellow version of this, the other, I think it's got a JX62. No, this is 62, 64. Whatever, the yellow one. Is more outputs and less inputs. So like Mike Campbell, for example, has the yellow one because he runs so many amps. So for us, because we're not amp switching, everything's always on, we use this. This basically gives me control of all the inputs. So if I was to have, say, 4 electric guitars with wireless packs, I could leave the packs always on during a show and mute from the rack. I can also hit the tech button, which takes it to a tuner output on my end, even though I might be using something else, whatever. And 5 and 6 inputs are DIs as well. So I love it because it's got the built-in DIs. All of my guitars come into the one place. I can mute, I can control. There's 2 amp outputs, so I can do A, B, or both. And you can split them. So like on Fleetwood Mac, even though I had 6 amps, because of the way they ran, I only needed 2 outputs with some splits on them. So that's the brains. The other great thing about it is that it runs the pedal board in a loop, which, as you are a huge advocate for, of like kind of cleaner tones, true bypass type stuff. If the pedal board was to go down, it knows to bypass, or I can switch it manually to bypass that loop and go pure signal out to the amps, which is huge. Coming back to redundancy, right? We went through so many different switching options, from like boutique small companies to huge companies and different versions of the radial stuff, and trying to work out like, what is it fundamentally that I need it to do? And that's the hard thing, I think, when you're buying gear. You're like, this does this and this does that, this does that. It's what do you actually need it to do, you know, at its core, and what do you need it to do quickly? So for me, I realized that the biggest thing was that we switch guitars every single song. So for me, amp thing is like to the wayside, and the main thing is being able to control my inputs for guitars and quickly do switches. And so because of this system, it means I have 1 cable. Neil never has to mess around with like having 3 cables on stage or an acoustic cable, and he only ever has 1 really beautiful, long, clean cable, and I'm switching it from it being an electric guitar going out to the amps, and also via the pedal board, or an acoustic guitar cable which skips the pedal board and goes straight to a DI. So this radial really is the brains of the whole rig. Then take a deep breath. I'll keep talking.
There we go.
Yeah, nerds. It's a time. Neil's not a huge fan of digital amps. The closest I've got him to is the Milkman Amp 50, the little tabletop guy, which we love and he loves, and he uses that in the home studio. Instead of having to run an amp, we'll run that into like Ableton or Pro Tools or whatever. I, as a tech, need redundancy. On a Fleetwood Mac size tour, I obviously, like I said, have flipped ISO cabs, which is my redundancy. But on a crowded house tour, where we're about 60% smaller in gear and footprint, I needed to have options. So I have, that's my own Kemper, and I have it in the rack. And I've designed the tone as a Fender Bassman patch from Mbrit. It's a really simple, really clean tone. It's what I used to use when I was a session guitar player, and it takes pedals really well. So tone itself is nothing, essentially. There's nothing going on in the Kemper. It's a glorified, practice amp, basically. But it takes pedals really well. So the way it's routed is that when the pedal board comes back in on the loop, it splits out and goes to the Kemper as well.
Yep.
So anything Neil is doing, obviously, on his pedal board is happening on the Kemper. And then the Kemper in the back of the rack just has a DI output, which we keep patched in, or the plan is for this tour to have it always patched. So the front of house guy, should he ever need it, can roll that up. Mm-hmm. And then there's a speaker output that I just put a speaker cable in the loom. And should something go down on stage or I lose both of them, I can take, say, the speaker from a Fender Princeton, put my trusty little barrel connector on it, and put the Kemper into that. And all of a sudden, Neil's hearing Kemper, and I've got control of it. So that's really a redundant, and it's a luxurious thing to have. And totally, I understand not everyone can. But there are, like, the Milkman's a great version of it. Like we would have, if we didn't have the Kemper, we would have a Milkman on a tray in here as something, something to produce noise. I've found that, like, after working with Neil for a fair few years, when something goes down, the one thing he yells at me is, get me something, anything. And I think that's maybe, like, the biggest takeaway from teching after all these years, is that you don't necessarily have to have something given back the second something breaks, but you have to have, like, the thing given back, but you have to have something given back. No one wants to be standing on there miming, And so that's Neil's thing. And so that, for me, is how I'm going to do that. It's a quick switch. It's always ready. It's always powered on. Another lesson from Steve McDonald is, like, if you have your redundancies or your backups, they've got to be ready. They've got to be powered. They've got to be patched, because there's no point. Otherwise, if it takes me 5 minutes to patch that to the front of house, then I've missed my chance, right?
Yep.
And that's when you have the artist going, well, you said, is what you want to avoid at all costs.
But if I'm understanding this right, the Kemper is always getting signal, and front of house is always seeing it. And so let's say, like, Armageddon happens and his pedal board dies at the same time all his tube amps die. You have an extremely quick backup to essentially get him from guitar straight into Kemper.
I do. The only thing that I sacrificed in that scenario when I designed this was that I did take it as a Y split off the pedal board. So if the pedal board did go down, the radial nose to jump over and bypass the board, that would mean the Kemper no longer gets signal. So that would mean a manual patch for me, which I'm very well aware of. There's a patch cable in the back of the rack that's cable tied up, ready to basically rip and plug. So, yes, if that scenario happened, that's one of kind of, say, maybe 10 probable scenarios. We have thought about it, and there is a redundancy for that scenario. It's not the quick flip, but for me, the pedal board going down is not the more common one. It's an amp on stage dying, or something like that.
Yep. In one of our recent videos, we did top 5 most common pedal board mistakes. And one of the things I talked about, and I'd be curious to get your insight into this, one of the most common points was when people don't understand their signal chain, and then something happens on stage and they have no idea where to start troubleshooting. Like, they don't have sound, and they don't know if they should look at their guitar, their amp, their pedal board. How important is it for you? I kind of know the answer to this, but how would you shed some light on the importance of understanding your signal chain as the musician that's using the rig?
Oh man, like, you're 100% right. A good friend of ours, Chochi Milani from Gang of Views, or ex-Gang of Views, who's now a solo artist and doing amazing things. He's, I didn't build the original boards for him, you built them. And so for me, and that, for anyone that's followed Goodwood, for a few years now, his multiple boards have appeared on your page a lot, right? And they're very complex boards. For an Australian band, for a slightly lower budget band, for a fly band, he has the most elaborate, incredible systems, and his tones and the things he does are mind-blowing. So for me as a tech walking into that, design that I didn't build and you built with him, it was really difficult because when things did go down, he had to fix them or he had to tell me. And like, honestly, there were times early on in Gang of Youths where things went down and he would have to be pointing and yelling and like, there's a 5-piece band playing on stage and he's trying to yell to me that something is not patched or this. So it's huge, you're right. And if you're the artist and you don't know and like you can't explain it to your tech or to someone else, then you're in huge trouble. It's not to say that you can't have an elaborate patching, kind of system or diagram, but like draw it out is the simplest way. Like when I start every rack build, I sit and draw it. I firstly sit within a notebook and I draw it, arrow, pedal or rack mount gear or whatever, arrow, whatever. Then I go into like a draw program online, like a free draw program, and I draw it physically. And then once I finish everything, I save it and I put it in a Dropbox and I always give it over to the artist. And it's like, that is the blueprint for anyone for coming on. Childish Gambino's set up, he has a huge band. He has a 5-piece band and the entire show is MIDI switched for everyone. Like it is intensely intense. They're all using fractal audio gear. They're all using huge pedal boards, as well as each one has synthesizers and stuff like that. So it is a huge rig. And I didn't build it. And it's incredibly built, impeccably built. But I didn't build it. So I came into that completely blind. And Darren, the tech who built it from Colorado, he does Bon Iver, he built all the Bon Iver systems, is a mastermind. He handed me that blueprint. And the only way I got through that Childish Gambino tour covering for him was that blueprint. I literally read it again. And then every time something went wrong, had to go back and read it again. So as an artist, like I strongly suggest, if you are going to go down the path that most people are going down now of 2-3 tier pedal boards and MIDI switching and wet, dry, wet, and all of these awesome things that we've come to in this day and age, please write a blueprint. Please get Grant to write your blueprint.
That's awesome. No, that's actually really good insight and I think really helpful, but one of those things that you don't need until you need it. And so, people are like, oh, I just got it built. I'll never need to, because it's not going to break. But especially on tours, when you're doing 40, 50 dates, things happen and you're going to wish you did it when something happens.
Totally. And look, if you're not going to do it, buy a true bypass switch, so then if your pedal goes down, it's out of the loop and you just, the second you touch it, you hear a crazy noise, don't touch it again. That's the gist. And that's where you're at. Some great companies make amazing switches now and that's where you're at.
Yeah.
So yeah, do that. As far as the pedal board for Neil goes, going back to the rig, it's pretty simple. I'll send you a photo instead of trying to awkwardly hold it up. He's a huge Memory Man, the vintage Memory Man band. That's always been a Neil Finn thing from Digger, the tech before me, who worked for him for about 12 years. He bought up every deluxe in very smart fashion, every deluxe Memory Man he could find. So I inherited about 15 of them because they do break all the time.
Yep.
So on this pedal board here, there's 2 deluxe Memory Mans. Huge hot tip for using a deluxe Memory Man or a vintage pedal that you know is going to break, avoid stepping on it. So we have Lila little, simple patch boxes that we touch on, and they're at, foot height. They're really convenient, and the Memory Man never gets touched. So the 2 that are on the board have been on the board all of Fleetwood Mac. Only once have they had an issue. Apart from that, it's pretty straightforward. The hot cake pedal, which is New Zealand's finest.
Yep.
Overdrive. It's beautiful. It's Neil's favorite overdrive. He really loves this this T-Rex MUDHONEY. It's a dual overdrive. They remade them, and the new ones aren't great. The older ones, they're cool. They're quite a thick, creamy overdrive. I don't think it's what I would choose to use, but he, again, like where you don't question the artist, Neil has this unique ability to make it sound like no one else makes it sound. Like, so this pedal that I personally would never have put in my top 10 list is actually amazing. When he plays it, it's the right pedal for him. They found each other.
Isn't that frustrating though? Because I've had this before as well. I'll hear someone that I look up to as a guitar player play this pedal through their rig, like they sound unbelievable. And then I put it on my rig, I'm like, it sounds terrible. I'm just I'm not them.
Oh man, how many kids, me included, go out and mimic someone's pedal board like a tube screamer? I can't make a tube screamer sound good. I cannot, no matter what, no matter if it's the most perfect vintage tube screamer, it doesn't sound good. But like some of my favorite guitar players, like people I've worked for use just a tube screamer, and it's so rad.
Yep.
I don't know. I get it. He uses the Electro Harmonics freeze pedal a lot. Mm-hmm. That's one of Neil's big tricks that he's so good at. Again, can't make it work. It's like it's stutters and it's like, it doesn't fit. He has this unbelievable ability, like when he's soloing, especially when he's doing like a, very Memory Man driven ambient solo, which Neil does so damn well. He'll hold down the holds and put a bass layer in there and man.
And go over top.
Yeah. And just start layering. Similar to Chochi, Chochi from Gang of Youths. He did that a lot as well. And like, it's just using both sides of your brain at the same time, which, I'm a simple man. I'm not out there doing that. So Neil does that a lot. Then there's a really simple DD3 pedal, which he uses if we're going to use time-based kind of warping. The DD3 is so basic and simple, like you don't lose control of it. So he knows we always start the show. One of the big things is starting the show at 50%. So he knows that if it's at 50% and he plays a line, if he goes all the way to the right or all the way to the left, it's a full octave down or up.
Gotcha.
And that's so during a show, Black Magic Woman or whatever, during Fleetwood Mac in the ambient section, he would pull it all the way down and it turns into that roll, like cool kind of warpy foundation. And honestly, like apart from that, we have Goodwood switches, obviously, that you guys have made, and then we have a custom mute box that you guys are currently making.
Yep.
For both him, Liam, and Nick on the boards, and then we use Leela stuff still under the board as well. So I'll use like a line driver or something from them. Just basically to have flexibility. It's like under the board, under the tier, I have a bit of a Swiss Army section where I put things in the signal, whether that be a phasing thing, whether that be a pad, whether that be whatever for whoever's gear, I always have something under there for me. Yep. And that's it. It's a pretty simple design.
So it's basically, to simplify his rig, some overdrives, freeze, DD3, Memory Mans. That's kind of the crux of his sounds. Is that right? Yep.
And I actually put at the beginning of Fleetwood, I put an XOTIC EP booster. I've always used one as an always on sparkling kind of line drive. I'm a huge fan of them. I think that they bring body to the tone like nothing else. And they're so simple. They're so cheap. You can have 10 of them,
Yep.
So I have one of them in the front of this ticket too. But then, sorry to cut you off, we also have other things that come in and out, like this Bondi FX overdrive pedals that we used a lot on the record. An amazing Australian company. EchoFix Australia, we use their outboard tape delay. So Neil routes into that. That's something that we're bringing into the Crowded House rig, so that we kind of have that vintage warble tone, and that when he controls it, we get the speed up and the ramp down. So that's a lot of ambient noises. It's not a cheap unit, but it's the best in the world. Neil would definitely tour tape machines if he could. And previously, you can't do that. They break every 2 seconds. So now that the guys at EchoFix Australia built that, we have that option. Liam and Neil are both using one of them now as well.
So do you think you'll actually bring that on tour?
That's the plan. Yeah. This rack is almost finished. The next stage for me is to sit in a room now with amps, run it as it will on stage, and work out how to get those controls for Neil to sit by him whilst having the delay unit in the rack and that type of stuff. So he definitely would love to. We use them in the studio. They're on the album. They're pretty incredible units. So yeah.
So are you using anything MIDI related in this rig?
Nothing.
Awesome. He really is old school, man. I love that.
Nothing, man. And, even for someone like Liam Finn, who that actually makes a lot of sense to, and we just, sense for, and we did discuss it, it's just he doesn't need it. You know, like he is a player who like, he doesn't want the same thing every night. Depending on the room, he's going to add or take away distortions, you know, or change his delays, or he's so hands-on and he loves to tap dance and he loves to like, you know, keep his feet on all the pedals that he just wouldn't have fun with MIDI. And I think there's definitely a place for MIDI in the world. Childish Gambino tour could not have happened without MIDI. The amount of switching and sounds that that band cover is unbelievable. And Ray, who plays in the Bronx, and Passion Pit and stuff, he plays guitar in the band, and he is like playing keys and playing solos and walking out on stage. Everything is MIDI switching for him, and it's imperative. But I think that everyone is very quick to add MIDI to their boards at the moment, and I don't necessarily think that it always needs to be the case. So if you're building a board at home, I would question whether you needed MIDI first. Because it's so cool to have your feet on pedals and to switch things. And sometimes you stumble across, you know, you tap tempo out of time, and that's the coolest thing ever. Like, that's why we bought pedals in the first place, you know? So I kind of like taking the mechanical aspect and putting it back in as as opposed to taking it away and adding the computers, personally.
Yeah, so MIDI would be a tool that applies to some and not to others, and just ask the question, do I need it, or should I partially implement it rather than having a fully controlled board? And then there's the other side of the spectrum with Childish Gambino, who it's everything.
Yeah, and like, you know, you guys, like, I've seen lately some of your builds that you've done, especially in America. You know, I think that they're amazing. Like, you know, you have the MIDI sync clock, like the disaster area, I think they're called, or whatever, where you can have a central tap that's controlling, if you have 4 Strymon pedals or whatever. That is so dope. I love that. And I understand that's where I think MIDI makes sense. But taking, you know, MIDI from the drummer's playback rig and adding another failure element, it's not necessary. Like, no one in the crowd notices when there's a slight delay in your change of delays, or whether your tone was a vintage Boss DD3 on the record, not a DD6. And, you know, your job as an artist, and I'm probably going to get crushed for this, but your job as an artist sound rad, you know, like, it's just to find that kind of tone live. It's half the fun.
Yeah, awesome. So moving on a little bit, with you being, you know, a guitar player, and I recently saw you post on your Instagram actually that you played guitar with Fifth Harmony and was it Camila?
Yeah.
Are you? I really wanted to ask you this question. Are you an absolute nightmare to tech for?
I don't think so.
I just had this like vision of like, you know what it means to be a tech, you know what should be done, when it should be done, the redundancies, the rigs, like all that. Like when people tech for you, are you pretty laid back, or are you like, this is how I want my rig, this is how it needs to be run, all that type of thing?
You know, like I'm pretty OCD about like things like cable runs and the way a pedalboard looks, as you guys are, you know, stuff like that. But no, I don't think so. I wasn't as much of a professional tech as I am now when I was playing guitar for a living. Like, that was my focus. So I kind of went as a kid from the age of 13 or whatever. I played in bands and started teching to go on tour, basically, to get out of the house and not go to high school. And so I always did them in parallel, and playing in a band was always what I thought I would do. And then it led to the session stuff in Australia, playing for pop artists and whatnot. So I hadn't really quite hit the level of teching that I guess I'm at now, or I've been at for a couple of years. At that point, I was lucky enough to have Hayden Vassallo tech for me for a number of years. He does Jimmy Barnes and Ian Moss and stuff in Australia. He's a really great dude, and he's a young dude like us. And he's great. I probably wasn't really in a position to even know about most of the stuff I know about. I think that I've only become the tech that I am, and I still, for the record, have so much to learn. Like, I'm nowhere near amazing tech, but I've only really hit that probably the last 5 years or something. And I think I've realized that being a tech in Australia, I was always a tech and tour manager. Like, everybody in Australia is, because of necessity, unfortunately, combining roles, saving money. And when you're teching, you're lucky. Like Gang of Youths, we had 3 techs. That's a lot of techs for an Australian band. We had 2 the majority of the time. DMAs was either 1 or 2. So you're not teching for a guy. You're teching for 5 guys or 4 guys. And sometimes you're doing playback too. So that style of teching is what I would call band-aid teching, where like if something breaks, you literally don't have time to fix it or to learn how to fix it for that matter. And in the modern day, you know, if something breaks, you send it away to get fixed. It's so quick and easy. There's FedEx and there's Australia Post and whatever. So really, like the bulk of my teching knowledge has morphed and really excelled since getting onto Fleetwood, or Neil Finn for that matter, where I work for one person. And if something breaks, I'm in the arena from 9 in the morning and the show is not till 7 p.m. I have all day, you know, to fix that thing. And if I don't know how to fix it, I'm not going to send it away, because there's 8 techs on Fleetwood Mac. Every single member has a tech. And like I said to you, the resumes of those techs are like unbelievable. So like I don't send things away. Like Chino, Mike Campbell's tech, is right next to me. He's worked with Tom Petty Nightbreakers for 40 years. Like I turn left and I go,
Crazy.
What just happened? Like, I don't know how to fix an amp. I didn't know how to fix an amp. Or, you know, even building racks, man. Like, I've always known how to do that stuff, but I didn't know how to do it well. You know, like, because you in Australia have a budget and a box, but coming into America or working for a slightly larger band or a bigger budget band, you have the time to really develop, you know, your skills and hone in and work out redundancy and stuff like that. So, no, I'm not a nightmare to tech for. However, if I go back to being a guitar player now, I probably might.
Oh, that's great, man. What, just some like rapid fire questions here. What was your favorite part about being a touring guitarist looking back?
I'm not a very good guitarist, to be perfectly honest. And I said that the other day to someone, and someone laughed and like, oh, you're a session guy. And I was like, legitimately, I'm not a good guitar player. Like anyone that knows me that I played with at home will be like going, yeah, it's true. It's quite shit. No, like I grew up in punk bands. I didn't go to the con. I didn't, you know, I grew up playing like 4-chord punk as fast and loud as I could. And my journey into being a session guitar player is so obscure, and it was like time and place. And I met a guy named Andrew Furs on the X Factor who basically changed my life and helped me to become a session player. And I had no fundamental knowledge of how to be a guitar player, but what I acquired from being in a punk band is to know rhythm and chords and melody, and performance was a huge thing. Like Andrew Furz's whole concept when he hired a bunch of people for the X Factor that weren't people from the con, like traditionally The Voice had done, or, you know, Australian Idol or whatever, was to get a performance element that had never been really put together. Like it was like, cool, here's a pop star, but here's this rad band that like know how to perform. And so like, if, you know, instead of selling for the record label to sell one artist, they're selling a whole package in a live show. And massive credit to him. Like no one had done that in Australian music before. And he really pushed the record labels to do that and changed a lot of our lives, like little punk dudes, you know? So going to playing guitar, I think I just come from a different way of thinking. And what that means is that my forte was to take, say, a simple 4-chord pop song and work out like, how can I play an A chord 3 different ways? You know, how can I sit on an acoustic guitar when we do the same promo in radio station after radio station and make every single time sound different and exciting? Because every time I could do that and put in a prettier chord or a different rhythmic pattern or whatever, the artist would get excited and they would sing better. And so as a music director, although I don't know from a playing perspective that I deserve to be there, I think as a music director, I earned, you know, my place coming in and really changing. Like going back, even when we talked about doing this interview, I went back and watched some things. And like, I think I've done some really cool performances where I managed to get vibe out of 4 chords over and over. Pop music it's really difficult to make pop music sound good acoustically. It's literally 4 chords. So myself and a bunch of my co-workers and colleagues, that's what we did. That's what we tried to do.
Love it. And then, so that's favorite thing about guitar. What about favorite thing or best memory looking at what you've done so far for being a tech?
Dude, you know, designing tone with Neil Finn, so cool. Like, I was on a friend's podcast recently and we talked about it, and I was saying how like I still have huge moments with Neil where I'm like, that's Neil Finn. Like, one question that you're probably going to ask me is my favorite guitar player of all time, and Neil's totally up there because of the story I just told you. That's the guy who can play a G chord 18 different ways and make you feel something different every single time. So I remember like sitting on the plane, Fleetwood Mac, as I said earlier, when I got that job, it was a huge jump up. It was like going from like high level Australian and some American stuff to Fleetwood Mac, and I was very anxious going into the role, talking to people, looking at people's resumes online, being like, holy shit, like why am I here? And sitting on the plane on the way over there, I had a moment. I can recall exactly like that feeling of like, how on earth is it my job to replicate a Fleetwood Mac guitar tone for Neil Finn? Like that is insanity. Like this is the kid who played a Marshall JCM 900 and a Fender Strat for a long time. Yep. Like not exactly the king of tone over here for a lot of my life anyway. So that's my favorite part about teching. Like, it's so cool to sit down and like break down tones and get inside Neil's head and work out like what is it that he's trying to create. Like I said to you before, it's not my job to come up with a tone. It's my job to work out what he's thinking about the tone and present it, or present as few options as possible to get progress. So that's definitely my favorite.
Love that, man. That's so cool. So you did steal my favorite guitar player question, but that was an awesome answer. So along those same lines, if there was one thing you've learned from Neil, being one of the guitar players you really look up to, one thing that you've learned from him that you would now apply to your own pedal board or your own playing, what would it be?
Simplify. I think I've worked for so many people, man, and I've seen some shows go down hard. I've, like without naming names, I've been in very high stress situations where the intro to a show has started and we've got laptops and we've got MIDI coming back to MIDI and everything has gone down and the crowd is booed and there's, 40,000 people watching and it feels horrific. It feels as bad as it sounds. And the thing about, the stuff that I've learned from Neil Finn, like I said to you, he's like, just get me something. And that's like, I think that as a performer, I'm not a performer, so it's probably not fair of me to throw shade or say anyway, but the fundamental has to be that like you're not there to indulge in tone, you're not there to indulge in your own thing, you're there because people love what you do. And I hope I'm not speaking out of line, but I think that at Neil's core, he understands that he's there because people want to hear him play and sing. And if that means playing a shitty guitar through a shitty amp, but singing, Don't Dream It's Over, he'll do it. And people will love it. And no one in the crowd, maybe 1% of the crowd is going to, it's tones off.
Yep.
You're like, wow. And to be honest, most people really dig when you see something like that happen. Like we had an incident somewhere in America where there was an incident with Stevie Nicks' microphone. And Fleetwood Mac, like with all the redundancies, the show never stops. It's very rare. I mean, how many bands have you seen at a high level where they've actually had to stop a song and start again? Almost never. That happened, and I'm telling you, it was by far one of the coolest moments of my life because Stevie had to be like, I'm sorry, we're going to start that again. Everyone ready? From the top. I was like, whoa. It's like everyone in the crowd is like, she's human. They're human. They make mistakes. That's so cool. Like we saw that. And that comes back to like not having computers and MIDI and redundancies. Like at Fleetwood Mac's core, they're just a rock and roll band there to perform, I think that all of those members have that same fundamental that Neil has. Actually, Mike Campbell, funnily, we were talking about it one day, Mike Campbell's tech and I, and we were talking about gear, and he was like, I've got all these guitars. I was like, oh man, like he's got 4 of these vaults on tour of like, a guitar museum, basically. And we were talking about guitars. He's like, I don't even care what I play though. I'll play whatever. I was like, oh, you do care, you know, like obviously you're not going to play whatever. And he was like, I'll play whatever, literally. And about 5 days later, we were somewhere in America, went to a pawn shop, and comes back, and I was standing talking to Neil Finn and stuff at soundcheck, and he comes in with this gig bag, this quite small gig bag, and which he does often. He goes pawn shopping and comes back with obscure guitars all the time. And Chino was like, my God, what has he bought? He pulls out a student Fender Squier guitar, like the ones that we all start with that come with an amp and a lead and a guitar. It had been painted by a school student as like an art thing, an exhibition. And he bought it for like $45 or something from the pawn shop. And so he comes in and he's like, look, how sick is this? Like, check it out. And we were like, this is ridiculous. You know, like China's like, my God, what are you doing? And he was like, Chino, get it ready for the show tonight. And Chino was like, I can't do anything with this. Like, not the strings, the neck angle. He's like, get it ready for the show. And so Chin is there all day. You should look up the rig rundown of Chinna, and you'll get a very good indication of this grumpy old bearded man who's the most amazing guy. He's sitting there swearing and, you know, spitting and angry, trying to fix the Squier guitar to Mike Campbell from the Heartbreaker Standard. So anyway, he gets it done, and sure enough, that night and every night from that moment on, in the rest of the Fleetwood Mac tour, Mike Campbell played that guitar on stage during, I think it was Dreams or something like that. He plays a Fender Squier, literally a $40 guitar. It actually had, the kid had glued an antenna on it. And we joked about it. I was like, if you pull up the antenna at the same time every night, the internet world is going to go crazy. And, so if you see any live videos of Mike Campbell pulling up an antenna during the chorus, it does nothing.
Way to ruin the mystery, man.
It does everything. Changes. Everything.
It engages the tone.
Right? That's the tone rotor.
Yeah.
But as a show, the same thing as Neil. It's like they don't need anything. At its core, he will do anything as long as he has tone. The playing, the tone, the sound, the vibe, the excitement, all starts and finishes with you as a player. Such a cool motto, such a cool thing to learn from like the big dogs at the top that I never had. You know, if I don't have the right pick, the gig was over. You know, I'd be like, I'm out. I don't have a 63 mil.
Yep. I don't even know if there's a better spot to finish on than that. I think that's such a cool way to sum it up. And I am so appreciative of your time, and thank you for making the time and walking us through this rig and stuff. This has been incredible. And I know the people watching are going to get a ton out of it. Is there any piece of advice that you would leave to guitar players out there watching this that you would say, some parting wisdom for us?
Get Goodwood to build your rigs.
Hey, I'll pay you later. Thank you.
No, I spend time and love finding tone and doing what you want to do. And we touched on it earlier. There is no right or wrong. The only thing that is wrong is when you don't look at your weakest asset. So please stop buying $4 Amazon package cables. They don't work, and if they work, they're not going to keep working, and they're going to ruin your life. So, spend money where you need to spend money, getting people like yourself in Goodwood to build really high-quality boards. You are stepping on that thing. It's getting dirty. It's getting wet. Spend the money when you got to spend the money, and then spend the rest of your time investigating, finding tone, finding shitty guitars that sound rad, being excited by music. That's why we're all here. That's why you're watching the nerdiest podcast ever.
Awesome, man. Marcus, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And have the best time on the Crowded House tour coming up. And go well.
Wear a mask, world. Wear a goddamn mask.
Good advice. See ya.
See ya.
I hope you guys enjoyed that and got a lot out of it. Again, post any questions below, and if any of them really stand out, I'll send them over to Marcus and make sure he gets an answer back to you. I hope you guys enjoyed today. We will see you next week for another video on the Goodwood Audio YouTube channel.